Topic 5. The Flight of Apollo 11 with Robert Schwalder. Listen to me for the words. Apollo, adventure, frail, Atlantic, destroyer, witness, takeoff, ambassador, congressman, celebrity, astronaut, flawlessly, mission, spacecraft, orbit, ignite, blast, creation, gravity, lunar module, compartment, maneuver, attach, televise, receding, squeeze, aluminum, combine, gravitational, circular, communication, approximately, surface, instrument, revolution, undock, autopilot, instruction, computer, crater, hazardous, manual, tranquility, sentiment, life support system, powdery, meteorite, desolation, particle, solar wind, laser reflector, seismometer, tremor, landslide, detect, This is a beautiful story on the flight of Apollo 11. Let's just listen to Robert Schwalder tell it in his own words.
Never in the history of man has there ever been such an adventure. 500 years ago, Christopher Columbus sailed across the unknown oceans to discover a new land. At night time, he stood on the deck of his little ship and looked up at the moon. 50 years ago, Charles Lindbergh flew his frail plane across the dark Atlantic. As he looked out the window, all he could see was the friendly, smiling moon. Edwin Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins also looked at the moon as their spaceship raced through the sky. But they were not only looking at the moon, they were heading for the moon. The great adventure began on July 16, 1969, when the huge Saturn rocket, as high as a 36-story building and as heavy as a Navy destroyer, lifted off from Earth. 1 million people were on hand to witness the takeoff personally, including ambassadors, congressmen, and celebrities from around the world. It was estimated that billions more saw it on television. The whole world prayed for the 3 brave astronauts as Apollo 11 began its journey. 160 million horsepower roaring from the 5 engines of the Saturn's first stage flawlessly lifted the rocket from the ground. The 8 million working parts in the rocket did their job perfectly as the mission of Apollo 11 began. Then, just 12 minutes later, the spacecraft went into Earth orbit 100 miles above the land. For the next 2.5 hours, the 3 astronauts made a final check on all the equipment aboard their ship. It was indeed a matter of life or death. This was the point of no return. All was go. The engine on the 3rd stage of the Saturn rocket was again ignited, and the spacecraft turned its nose towards the moon and blasted out of Earth orbit. "We're on our way," shouted the 3 astronauts as the world held its breath. For the first time since the creation, man was about to break free from the ever-possessing pull of the Earth's gravity. For the first time, man had a ticket to the stars. Shortly after the astronauts left the Earth orbit, the lunar module was shot out of its storage compartment and by careful maneuvering was docked to the front of the mothership. The lunar module was named the Eagle. The mothership was called Columbia. Once again, all went well, and with the Eagle firmly attached to the front of the Columbia, the 3 men continued to race towards the moon. Occasionally, they took time out of their busy schedule to allow the rest of the world to join in their thrilling adventure. They televised pictures of the receding Earth and of the approaching moon. They showed life aboard the spaceship. Early astronauts used to squeeze all of their food out of aluminum tubes, but the Apollo 11 men dined in good style. They were able to make sandwiches using real bread, and they had instant foods, which simply by adding hot water turned into rather delicious meals. It was estimated that it cost nearly $200 to feed each man for 1 day. Indeed, the food should have been fit for kings. 4 days after takeoff from the Earth, the men in their ship approached the moon. If they continued at the same speed, the spacecraft would simply have swung around the moon and then started back to Earth. The plan called for the astronauts to turn their spaceship around backwards and then to fire the engine long enough so that their speed would be properly reduced. This lower speed, combined with the gravitational pull of the moon, would then result in a circular orbit around the moon. At this point, the spaceship was behind the moon, and for more than a half hour, all radio communication with the Earth was cut off. It was indeed an anxious moment for the millions who waited on Earth. Did the engine turn on? Did it burn long enough? How was everything going? Then, after what seemed like ages, Armstrong's voice came on the air. It was like perfect, he said. The engine had done its job. Apollo 11 was in lunar orbit, flying approximately 50 miles above the surface. Everything was going well. The path was exactly what the flight pattern had called for. The men checked all of the instruments and were satisfied that all was going according to schedule. With that, then, they went to sleep. The last sleep before men would walk on the moon. And yet they were able to sleep well, and none of them reported having had any dreams. After 4 hours of sleep, they were awakened by a call from Houston Control. This was the day everyone had been waiting for. When the ship was in its 11th orbit around the moon, Aldrin and Armstrong left the Columbia and crawled through the tunnel into the lunar module Eagle. For 2 hours they checked all of the systems in the strange-looking lunar ship, making sure that all was well. Then, as the ship was making its 13th revolution around the moon, the Eagle was undocked from the mother ship. "The Eagle has wings," announced Armstrong. The engine on the Eagle was fired so as to slow the ship down and drop it into an orbit only 10 miles above the moon. Then the engine again was turned on, and the speed slowly reduced as the lunar module approached closer and closer to the surface of the moon. The landing was supposed to have been controlled by an autopilot which followed the instructions of a computer. But as the module was 300 feet above the moon, Armstrong saw that the landing area below was a crater with many rocks. Landing there would be most hazardous. Armstrong took over the manual controls and adjusted their forward speed until they passed over the crater. Then, little by little, the Eagle descended and finally touched the moon. Armstrong shut off the engine and then called to Houston, "Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Man was on the moon." Aldrin and Armstrong were first supposed to sleep, but they reported that they didn't want to sleep and that they wanted to walk on the moon. It was a sentiment shared by the whole world. After coming so far and having waited so long, who could sleep? The two first men on the moon got their equipment ready and put on their portable life support systems. 6 hours after landing on the moon, they opened the hatch and got ready to walk on the moon. A television camera was first lowered so that the whole world could witness this historic moment. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to step on the moon. His first words after putting foot on the moon were, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." The surface of the moon was soft and powdery, and each step made a new footprint that would remain almost forever. Since there is no atmosphere and no wind on the moon, it will take 500,000 years for tiny meteorites to wipe out the footprints. 16 minutes later, Aldrin became the second man on the moon. He described the scene as beautiful, beautiful, magnificent desolation. But they had little time for sightseeing. They were scientists, not tourists, and they were able to stay on the moon only for a little over 2 hours. So immediately, they got to work doing the jobs that they had practiced for months back on Earth. They set up a frame of aluminum to capture particles from the solar wind. It was, they said, easy to walk, despite the fact that the gravity on the moon was only 1/6 as great as that on the Earth. An American flag was erected, with its cloth banner held straight out by means of a wire. No wind on the moon to flutter Old Glory. A laser reflector was set on the moon, and within days this was being used by scientists on Earth to measure the exact distance of the moon. Then a seismometer was erected, which would record tremors on the moon. Even small landslides from lunar craters could be detected by this instrument and then radioed back to Earth. The biggest job of the day was to collect moon rock and moon dirt. They collected as many different kinds of rock as they could see. They dug 5 inches into the moon soil and removed samples. Everything was first put into plastic bags and then sealed into 2 aluminum boxes. All in all, the 2 men collected about 80 pounds of moon material, which the world was waiting for. So much Aldrin and Armstrong still wanted to do, but it would have to wait for another time. After having walked on the moon for 2.5 hours, the 2 men returned to the lunar module and closed the door. They had done their job well. After eating a small meal, another historic event took place. For the first time, man slept on the moon.
Idiomatic English. Please repeat after me if you like. Head for. Which way are you heading for? It's getting late. We better head for home. On hand. I ordered the driver to be on hand that morning. on one's way. I came across him on my way to school. Take time. Take time to eat your meals. Used to. You used to live in Kyoto, didn't you? In good style. He lives in good style.